The emergency alarm echoed through the massive halls of the Galactic Council building on Centauri Prime, and every representative from across known space felt their blood run cold when they heard it, because this particular sound had not been heard in over 300 years, and it meant only one thing. Complete extinction of an entire species was happening right now. Chairman Rolth of the Centauri Federation stood at the center of the great circular chamber, where beings from hundreds of different worlds gathered in desperate panic, and his forearms trembled as he activated the main display screen that showed the horror unfolding across the galaxy, and what everyone saw made even the most battle-hardened warriors among them step back in fear. The transmission came through broken and filled with static, but the voice of Chancellor Velox from the peaceful Volani Republic was clear enough for the universal translators to process, and his words carried the weight of absolute desperation as he spoke to every civilized world at once and begged for help that might never come in time to save his people. This is our final broadcast to the Galactic Council, and to all who can hear our voice across the stars, and we are dying here on Theros Prime while our colonies burn one by one, and the Korath Horde consumes everything we have built over 10,000 years of peaceful existence, came the voice through speakers that carried it to every corner of the chamber where representatives sat in stunned silence. The display showed images that no one wanted to see but could not look away from, because the Korath Horde was unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever faced before, and their biomechanical ships moved like living creatures while they turned entire cities into processing centers where the population was harvested for genetic material and technological knowledge. 17 of our colonies have fallen in the past month, and each time they take our defensive capabilities and add them to their own forces, which makes them stronger and more dangerous with every world they consume, continued Chancellor Velox, whose voice now carried the sound of explosions in the background and the screams of his people as they faced their final moments. The Korath were not just conquerors but something far worse, because they had evolved beyond normal biological limits by fusing their bodies with mechanical technology, and they could adapt to any weapon or defense system within hours of encountering it, and this made them practically unstoppable once they began their advance through space. Chairman Rolth looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who commanded the greatest military forces in known space, and saw only fear and helplessness, because every species present had heard stories of what happened when the Korath Horde came to visit, and none of those stories had happy endings for the defenders. Our healing technologies and philosophical wisdom mean nothing against an enemy that sees knowledge itself as food, and our peaceful ways have left us defenseless against creatures that live only to consume and grow stronger, said the voice from Theros Prime, while the display showed massive bioships landing on the surface of the Volani homeworld, like terrible insects settling on a dying animal. The Andromedan Navy commander stood up with his blue-scaled skin shimmering under the chamber lights and spoke in the careful diplomatic language that meant he was about to suggest something that would sound reasonable but accomplish nothing useful in the real world. Perhaps we should consider a strategic withdrawal from that sector of space and establish a defensive perimeter around our more valuable systems while we study this threat and develop appropriate countermeasures, he said, while his three eyes avoided looking directly at the images of destruction on the main screen. The Silicon Collective representative buzzed with electronic sounds that translated as agreement with the withdrawal plan, and added suggestions about opening diplomatic channels with the Korath leadership to negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution that would preserve the greatest number of lives possible under the circumstances. But even as these words were spoken, everyone in the chamber knew they were meaningless, because the Korath Horde had never negotiated with anyone, and they did not take prisoners or accept surrender, and they certainly did not care about preserving lives that they saw as nothing more than biological resources to be processed and consumed. The debate continued for several hours while Chancellor Velox transmitted increasingly desperate reports about the final defense of Theros Prime, and how his people were making their last stand in the ancient capital city, where their greatest libraries and art collections were housed, but would soon be lost forever to the advancing Horde representatives from dozens of worlds offered sympathy and promised to remember the Volani Republic with honor after it was gone. but none of them could offer actual military assistance because their own fleets were already stretched thin defending their borders against other threats across the galaxy. It was during this moment of helpless despair that a quiet voice spoke from the furthest corner of the chamber where the newest members of the Galactic Council sat, and everyone turned to look at Ambassador Kang Minho from the recently contacted world called Earth. The human representative was smaller than most of the beings present, and his dark hair and brown eyes made him seem almost fragile compared to the massive warriors and advanced technological species that dominated galactic politics. But there was something in his expression that made others uncomfortable when they looked at him directly. "Send us the coordinates of the Korath fleet positions and the tactical data on their capabilities," Minho said in a voice that carried no emotion but somehow managed to fill the entire chamber with its quiet intensity. And he stood up slowly while keeping his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. The chamber fell completely silent because no one had expected the humans to speak during this crisis, since they were barely recognized as a proper galactic civilization and had only achieved faster-than-light travel about 50 years ago, which made them primitive newcomers compared to species that had been exploring space for thousands of years. Chairman Rolth looked at the human with something that might have been pity, because everyone knew that Earth had a small fleet of outdated ships and limited experience with interstellar warfare, and sending them against the Korath horde would be like throwing children into a fire to see if they could put it out. Ambassador Minho: "The Korath horde has conquered 47 star systems in the past year alone, and their adaptive technology makes them nearly impossible to defeat in conventional warfare," said the chairman while trying to be diplomatic about explaining why the human offer was both brave and completely useless. But Minho just nodded as if he understood the situation perfectly, and then said something that made every being in the chamber feel a chill run down their spine or equivalent body parts, because his words carried a certainty that seemed to come from some deep knowledge that the rest of the galaxy did not possess. "Chairman Rolth, you asked for someone to help the Volani Republic, and we are volunteering to do exactly that," he said, while looking directly at the images of destruction on the main screen where Korath bioships were systematically dismantling the last defenses around the beautiful crystal cities that had taken the Volani centuries to build. The Draxian war leader, whose people had been fighting the Korath for over a decade without success, stood up and spoke in the growling voice that his species used when they were angry or frustrated about something they could not control. "Human, the Korath have never been stopped by anyone, and they learn from every battle, which makes them stronger each time they fight, and your species has no experience with this kind of enemy," he said while his claws extended slightly in the gesture that Draxians made when they were trying to be protective rather than threatening. But Minho looked at the massive warrior with those dark eyes that seemed to hold something dangerous just beneath the surface, and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes at all, and made several representatives step back involuntarily because they suddenly realized they might not understand humans as well as they thought they did. "War leader Cracks, the Korath have never fought humans either, and they have no idea what we are capable of when someone asks us for help," said the human ambassador while walking toward the main display where images of the dying Volani homeworld continued to broadcast the final moments of an ancient civilization. The transmission from Chancellor Velox cut through the chamber one more time with words that would haunt everyone present for years to come, because they could hear in his voice that he knew his people were about to die and wanted the galaxy to remember what had been lost when the Korath finished their work. "To anyone who receives this message, please remember that the Volani Republic stood for knowledge and healing and art, and we tried to make the galaxy a more beautiful place during our time among the stars," he said, while explosions grew louder in the background and the sound of biomechanical creatures could be heard getting closer to wherever he was broadcasting from. Minho walked to the communications console and entered his authorization codes to open a direct channel to Earth, while every other representative watched in fascination and growing dread, because they were about to witness something that would change how the galaxy viewed the newest species to join their community. "Earth Command, this is Ambassador Minho requesting immediate implementation of protocol." The emergency session of the United Nations Emergency Assembly convened in the deep underground bunkers beneath Geneva, where the most classified military operations were planned and General Park Hijin stood before the massive holographic display that showed real-time images of the Korath destruction across Volani space. While her staff of the most dangerous humans on Earth waited for orders, the images coming through the quantum communication arrays were worse than anything the intelligence reports had suggested, because the Korath bioships were not just destroying cities, but systematically harvesting the knowledge and genetic material of an entire civilization that had spent 10,000 years building something beautiful and peaceful in a hostile galaxy park, studied the tactical data with the cold analytical mind that had made her the youngest general in Earth Defense Force history. And she saw exactly what the Korath were doing wrong, because they had never encountered a species that understood the true nature of warfare as completely as humanity did, and this would be their final mistake. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been asked to help the Volani Republic, and we are going to do exactly that, but not in the way the Galactic Council expects, she said while turning to face the assembled officers and specialists who represented every aspect of human military capability, and each one of them had volunteered for what they knew would be a one-way mission. The holographic display shifted to show detailed analysis of Korath biomechanical technology and their adaptive capabilities that allowed them to absorb the defensive systems of conquered species and integrate them into their own forces within hours of encountering new weapons or tactics. The Korath horde has been successful because they fight civilized enemies who follow the established rules of galactic warfare and try to minimize casualties while preserving infrastructure and cultural sites. Park continued while highlighting the pattern of previous battles where species had attempted to negotiate or establish defensive perimeters. But as she spoke, the assembled humans began to understand why they had been called together, because Earth had never been a civilized world by galactic standards, and humanity had learned warfare in a school where the only rule was survival, and the only acceptable outcome was the complete elimination of threats to human existence. Colonel Lee Jae-won stepped forward from the group of military specialists, and his scarred face showed the results of fighting in every major conflict Earth had seen over the past 20 years, including the Martian Rebellion, where his tactical innovations had turned a 6-month siege into a 3-day massacre of enemy forces. General Park, the Korath adaptive technology is impressive, but it has a fundamental weakness that other species have not exploited, he said while calling up technical specifications that showed how the biomechanical systems required time to analyze and integrate new threats. And during that analysis period, they were vulnerable to tactics they had never encountered. Behind him, Captain Kim Subin nodded in agreement, because her psychological warfare techniques had broken enemy morale in conflicts across the solar system, and she understood that the Korath confidence came from never meeting an opponent that fought to win, rather than simply to survive until a diplomatic solution could be found. The Galactic Council species fight wars like they are playing games with rules that both sides agree to follow, but humanity learned warfare from predators and prey animals, where the only rule is that the winner gets to keep breathing, she said while reviewing intelligence reports about Korath communication methods and command structures. Lieutenant Commander Cho Min-seok moved silently to the front of the group because his special operations background made him uncomfortable with large gatherings, but his expertise in infiltration and sabotage was exactly what would be needed to get close to Korath command vessels and plant the surprises that Earth engineers had been developing. The Korath have never faced an enemy that deliberately appears weaker than they actually are, and their entire tactical doctrine assumes that species will use their best weapons and defenses from the beginning of any conflict, he said, in the quiet voice that made other soldiers nervous because they knew he was thinking about very unpleasant ways to kill people. Dr. Yunari stepped up from the civilian specialist group with her biological warfare research files, and everyone in the room felt slightly uncomfortable, because her work involved creating weapons that the Galactic Council had banned as too horrific to use even in the most desperate circumstances. I have been studying Korath genetic samples that our deep space monitoring stations collected from their previous battles, and their biomechanical integration has created some interesting vulnerabilities that can be exploited if we are willing to violate several dozen galactic treaties regarding biological warfare, she said with the calm voice of a scientist discussing laboratory results. Engineer Bae Dong-yun activated his own display showing weapon systems that officially did not exist and had never been tested against living targets, because Earth Command preferred to keep some capabilities hidden until they were absolutely necessary for species survival. The Korath adaptive technology works by analyzing energy signatures and mechanical components, but it cannot adapt to weapons that change their fundamental nature during combat, or that operate on principles the target has never encountered, he explained while showing designs that seemed to violate several laws of physics. The assembled team began to understand what kind of mission they were being asked to undertake because this was not a rescue operation or a defensive action, but something that Earth Command had been planning since the first reports of Korath expansion had reached human space through Galactic Communication. Network's General Park activated the final display that showed Earth fleet positions and the specialized ships that had been secretly constructed in the asteroid belt shipyards where no galactic observers were allowed to monitor human military development. Operation Prometheus is not designed to save the Volani Republic because by the time we reach their space there will probably be nothing left to save, she said, while the harsh reality of the tactical situation became clear to everyone in the room who understood that they were too far away to prevent the extinction of an entire civilization. Our mission is to make absolutely certain that the Korath Horde never threatens anyone again, and that requires us to study their capabilities while demonstrating why Earth has never lost a war against any enemy stupid enough to make us angry. She continued while highlighting the fleet movements that would bring human forces into contact with the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever produced. Song Hyunwoo raised his hand from the back of the group, where the survival specialists were standing because his expertise in extreme environment operations would be critical for the long-range deep space mission that would take them far from any possibility of rescue or resupply. General, the mission duration and distance from Earth support means we will be operating independently for months or possibly years, and the Korath will have time to analyze our initial capabilities and adapt their defenses accordingly, he said while reviewing the logistical challenges of maintaining a fleet in hostile territory. But Park smiled with the expression that made enemy negotiators surrender before the shooting started because she knew something about human capabilities that the rest of the galaxy had not yet discovered and would learn about in the most unpleasant way possible. Specialist Song, the Korath will certainly try to adapt to our initial capabilities, but they are going to discover that humans do not have fixed capabilities and we improve our weapons and tactics during combat in ways that their biomechanical systems cannot predict or counter, she said while activating classified files that showed human weapons development over the past century. Assembled team began to review the technical specifications and realized that Earth had been preparing for this kind of enemy since the first contact with galactic civilization because human military analysts had studied every conflict in recorded galactic history and identified patterns that other species had missed. Han Ji-won stepped forward from the infiltration specialist group with her analysis of Korath command structures and the weaknesses that could be exploited by operatives who were willing to spend months or years embedded in enemy territory, gathering intelligence and creating opportunities for strategic strikes. The Korath leadership believes they understand all possible forms of warfare because they have absorbed the knowledge and tactics of 47 different species, but they have never encountered opponents who deliberately deceive enemies about their true capabilities, she said while showing communication intercepts that revealed Korath strategic planning. The final briefing materials showed that Earth had been monitoring Korath expansion for over a year and had identified exactly how their biomechanical adaptation systems worked and what kinds of threats would cause them to malfunction or become counterproductive to their survival. General Park walked to the center of the room and looked at each member of the assembled team while understanding that she was sending the most dangerous humans in existence on a mission that would change how every species in the galaxy understood the true nature of warfare. The Galactic Council thinks they are asking Earth to help with a rescue mission, but what they are actually doing is introducing the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of what had once been Volani territory, and Admiral Shin Tae-hoon stood on the bridge of the flagship Incheon while studying the tactical display that showed exactly what they had expected to find because the beautiful crystal cities and peaceful colonies were gone, and in their place were the biomechanical processing stations that marked another successful Korath conquest. The long-range sensors detected Korath patrol ships moving through the outer system like mechanical sharks, searching for any remaining survivors to harvest and their bioships. pulsed with the absorbed technologies of dozens of conquered species. While their adaptive armor showed the energy signatures of weapons that had failed to stop them, Tehun activated the communication array and sent the recognition codes to the other ships in his fleet while knowing that every vessel carried weapons and capabilities that the Galactic Council had never seen and would probably ban if they understood what Earth engineers had created in the deep asteroid belt shipyards. All ships, this is Admiral Tehun, and we are now entering the operational zone where we will demonstrate why the Korath Horde made a serious mistake when they decided to exterminate peaceful species in front of humans, he said while watching the approaching enemy formations that were moving to intercept what appeared to be a small and poorly equipped rescue fleet. The Korath scouts had detected the human ships easily because they made no attempt at stealth and broadcast standard galactic identification codes that marked them as a primitive military force with outdated weapons and defensive systems that any competent enemy could defeat without significant effort. What the biomechanical scouts could not detect were the true capabilities hidden beneath the deliberately crude exterior hulls that had been designed to look like the kind of ships that desperate civilizations threw together when they had no other options left for defending themselves. Colonel Lee Jae-won monitored the tactical situation from the command center buried deep inside the Incheon, where banks of quantum computers were analyzing every detail of Korath ship movements and communication patterns, while preparing to implement strategies that no galactic species had ever attempted in combat. Admiral, the Korath are deploying their standard conquest formation with bioships arranged to maximize their adaptive capabilities, while their command vessels remain protected behind layers of expendable attack units, he reported while highlighting the enemy positions on the main display. The approaching Korath fleet consisted of over 300 biomechanical ships that represented the accumulated military knowledge of 47 conquered civilizations, and their adaptive technology had never failed to absorb and counter any weapon or defense system they encountered during their expansion across the galaxy. Captain Kim Subin activated her psychological warfare equipment and began broadcasting on Korath communication frequencies with messages designed to confuse their command structure and create uncertainty about human capabilities, without revealing any actual information about Earth military technology. Korath Fleet. Commander, this is Captain Kim of the Earth Defense Force, and we are here to discuss your immediate withdrawal from this system, she transmitted while knowing that the enemy would interpret this as either desperate bluffing or complete insanity from a hopelessly outmatched opponent. The response came back within minutes, translated through captured Volani technology, and carried the arrogant confidence of predators who had never encountered prey that fought back effectively enough to cause them concern about the outcome of any battle. Primitive human vessels, you will surrender your biological material and technological knowledge, or we will take them by force after destroying your ships and processing your crews, came the message from the Korath command ship, while biomechanical vessels moved into attack positions. Admiral Tehun looked at the tactical display, where hundreds of enemy ships were surrounding his small fleet like predators, moving in for an easy kill, and activated the communication channel that would carry his response to every Korath vessel within range of their sensors. Korath Commander. This is Admiral Tehun of Earth Command, and I need to inform you that your species has made a fundamental error in judgment by attracting our attention, he said while his weapons officers began final activation sequences for systems that had never been tested against living targets. The battle began exactly as human tactical analysis had predicted, with Korath bioships opening fire, using energy weapons that had been absorbed from dozens of different species, and their adaptive armor immediately began analyzing the electromagnetic signatures of human defensive systems for exactly 17 minutes. The engagement appeared to follow the standard pattern of Korath victories, with human ships taking damage from weapons they could not effectively counter, while their own attacks seemed to have minimal impact on biomechanical hulls that adapted to each new threat within moments of contact. Lieutenant Commander Cho Min-sok watched the battle from his infiltration ship that appeared to be disabled and drifting helplessly toward the enemy formation while actually carrying penetration charges that would deliver very unpleasant surprises to any Korath vessels that tried to board and process what looked like helpless human survivors. The enemy adaptation process was working exactly as their intelligence reports had indicated, with biomechanical systems analyzing human weapon signatures and developing countermeasures that would make conventional attacks increasingly ineffective as the battle continued. But engineer Bae Dong-yeon was monitoring the Korath adaptation patterns from his position in the weapon development ship, and when their biomechanical systems reached the predetermined analysis threshold, he activated the systems that would teach them why human military technology was fundamentally different from anything they had encountered before. Every human ship simultaneously jettisoned its outer hull sections to reveal weapon arrays that existed nowhere in any galactic database and operated on principles that the Korath biomechanical systems could not analyze or understand, because they had been designed specifically to defeat adaptive technology. The quantum disruptors began firing coherent streams of probability manipulation that did not destroy enemy ships, but simply made them cease to exist by removing them from all possible quantum states. And the effect was so disturbing that nearby Korath vessels began retreating before their sensors could complete analysis of what had happened. Temporal mines activated throughout the battle zone and began causing explosions that occurred several minutes before they were deployed, which created causality loops that made Korath navigation computers malfunction because they could not process events that violated the normal flow of time. Dr. Yoon Nari activated her biological warfare systems that released engineered viruses designed specifically to target the genetic markers that allowed Korath biomechanical integration, and within hours, enemy crews would begin experiencing system failures as their organic components rejected their mechanical enhancements. But the true horror began when Colonel Lee Jae-won implemented Protocol Achilles, which involved using captured Korath technology against them in ways that their own systems could not recognize or defend against, because human engineers had reverse-engineered their adaptation process and found ways to make it work backwards. The human ships began broadcasting false technological signatures that caused Korath biomechanical systems to adapt to weapons that did not exist while simultaneously deploying actual weapons that operated on completely different principles than the fake signatures suggested. Admiral Tae-hoon watched the enemy formation begin to collapse as Korath ships found their adaptive systems working against them, and their biomechanical components began rejecting each other in cascading failures that spread through their fleet like a technological plague. All ships implement pursuit protocols, and remember that we are not here to defeat the Korath horde but to ensure that they never threaten anyone again, he ordered, while human vessels began chasing the fleeing enemy ships with weapons that continued to evolve and adapt, faster than biomechanical systems could analyze them. The Korath retreat became a rout as their command structure realized that they were facing an enemy that not only refused to follow the established rules of galactic warfare, but seemed to understand their adaptive technology better than they did, and was using it to destroy them from within their own systems. Captain Kim Subin began broadcasting psychological warfare messages directly into Korath communication networks using their own technology to carry transmissions that would reach every biomechanical ship in their fleet and begin breaking down the collective confidence that made their expansion possible. Korath vessels. This is Captain Kim, and I want you to understand that you are not fighting the Galactic Council or any civilized species that will negotiate for peace or accept reasonable surrender terms, she transmitted, while watching enemy formations scatter in panic. The human pursuit continued across 3 star systems while Korath ships discovered that their biomechanical adaptation systems were becoming liabilities rather than advantages, because every attempt to analyze human weapons resulted in further system. The retreat became something far worse than a military defeat, as Captain Kim Subin implemented psychological warfare protocols that had never been used against an alien species, because Earth Command had developed them specifically for enemies, who believed they understood all possible forms of combat and needed to be educated about human creativity in applying terror as a tactical weapon. Her transmission arrays penetrated deep into Korath communication networks, using their own mechanical technology to carry messages directly to the collective consciousness that linked every member of their species. And what she sent was not threats or demands, but questions that would make them doubt everything they thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. Korath Horde, you have spent thousands of years believing you were the perfect predators. But what happens when you discover that predators can also be prey, and that somewhere in this galaxy, there are things that Hunt creatures like you for sport. Her voice echoed through biomechanical ships where crews suddenly realized they had never considered the possibility that they might not be at the top of the food chain. Lieutenant Commander Cho Min-seok coordinated his infiltration teams across 17 different Korath staging areas. And instead of destroying supply depots and command centers, they began leaving evidence of their presence without actually damaging anything, because the psychological impact of knowing that enemies could walk freely through their most secure facilities was far more devastating than any explosion. The Korath supply officers would arrive at ammunition dumps to find that everything had been carefully reorganized according to human military standards, and weapons had been disassembled and reassembled in ways that demonstrated complete understanding of biomechanical technology while leaving everything functional, but subtly improved. Sentries would be found unconscious at their posts and wake up in different locations wearing uniforms that had been cleaned and repaired, while their weapons had been upgraded with modifications that made them more effective, but also proved that human infiltrators could have killed them at any time and chose not to. The message was clear to every member of the Korath military hierarchy, because humans were not just defeating them in open combat, but demonstrating that their entire defensive infrastructure was useless against enemies who could appear anywhere and leave whenever they wanted without being detected or stopped. Dr. Yoon Nari released the third-generation biological agents that did not attack Korath physiology, but instead forced their biomechanical integration systems to evolve in specific directions that made them more dependent on their mechanical components, while reducing their biological flexibility and adaptability. The result was that Korath warriors found themselves becoming more machine than living creature, and losing the biological advantages that had made their species successful predators, while gaining mechanical limitations that made them vulnerable to weapons designed specifically to exploit technological rather than biological weaknesses. Engineer Bae Dong-yoon deployed conversion viruses throughout captured Korath equipment that would remain dormant for weeks or months before activating and turning biomechanical systems against their users in ways that could not be detected until the moment when weapons refused to fire or armor systems began attacking the beings they were supposed to protect. His quantum entanglement weapons began targeting Korath ships across multiple dimensions simultaneously, which meant that destroying one vessel would cause identical damage to appear on other ships that were connected through biomechanical networking systems, and the effect spread through their fleet like a technological plague. But the true psychological breakthrough came when survival expert Song Hyun-woo completed his analysis of Korath expansion patterns and discovered that their entire civilization was built on running away from something that had terrorized them so completely that they had spent millennia consuming other species to build strength against a threat they could no longer even remember clearly. Captain Kim, I have found something in the Korath racial memory that explains why they became biomechanical predators, he reported while transmitting data that showed migration patterns stretching back thousands of years and indicating that the Korath homeworld had been abandoned after contact with something that made them flee across the galaxy. The ancient records buried in biomechanical memory systems told the story of a species that had once been peaceful explorers until they encountered entities in the galactic core region that hunted advanced civilizations for reasons that the survivors could not understand and barely escaped, with enough population to begin rebuilding elsewhere. Song analyzed the data and realized that the Korath horde had been created by survivors who were so traumatized by their encounter with these galactic core predators that they developed biomechanical technology as a defense mechanism and began consuming other species to make themselves strong enough to never be helpless victims again. The Korath are not conquerors by nature, but refugees who have been running from something for so long that they forgot they were running and convinced themselves they were predators, he explained while highlighting the psychological profile that showed a species driven by ancient terror rather than natural aggression. Captain Kim immediately understood the tactical implications, because if the Korath were motivated by fear rather than confidence, then the right kind of psychological pressure could break their entire civilization by reminding them that they were still running from something and had never actually become strong enough to stop being afraid. She began broadcasting new messages into their communication networks that did not threaten the Korath with human weapons, but instead asked questions about what they were really afraid of and why they needed to consume so many other species if they were truly as powerful as they claimed to be. Korath Horde. If you are such perfect predators, then why do you need to keep running? And why do you consume other species, instead of creating your own technology? And why are your ships designed for flight rather than prolonged combat? Her transmissions carried directly into the collective consciousness where millions of biomechanical minds suddenly remembered fears they had been trying to forget. The psychological warfare campaign expanded as human infiltration teams began leaving evidence in Korath facilities that suggested the galactic core entities were still active and still hunting advanced civilizations, and might have already detected the biomechanical signature that marked Korath technology. Across known space, Lieutenant Commander Cho Min-seok planted monitoring devices that would broadcast fake sensor readings indicating massive ships moving through deep space toward Korath territory, and the transmissions were designed to match the energy signatures that appeared in their oldest racial memories as associated with the entities that had originally driven them from their homeworld admiral. Shin Tae-hoon coordinated the fleet movements to create the impression that human forces were not operating independently, but were actually working with or for something much larger and more dangerous that preferred to remain hidden while using humanity as a tool for specific purposes. All ships implement Protocol Nemesis and begin broadcasting the deep space contact signatures while maintaining pursuit of Korath forces, he ordered, while knowing that the combination of military defeat and psychological terror would break enemy morale more effectively than any conventional weapon. The Korath fleet commanders began reporting contact with unidentified vessels that matched the descriptions in their racial memory archives and bio. Mechanical crews started experiencing system failures that seemed to be triggered by proximity to whatever was hunting them through the dark. Between stars, Dr. Yoon Nari activated her most sophisticated biological weapons that did not attack Korath physiology directly, but instead triggered genetic memories of the ancient encounter that had created their civilization and made them remember exactly what they were still running from after thousands of years of trying to become strong enough to stop being prey. Engineer Bae Dong-hyun deployed his temporal manipulation devices in ways that created time distortions around Korath ships and made their sensors detect energy signatures that existed in their past when they had first encountered the galactic core entities that had traumatized their entire species into becoming refugees. The combined effect of military defeat and psychological warfare that reminded them of their deepest fears began breaking down Korath unit cohesion as biomechanical crews started abandoning their posts and their adaptive technology began malfunctioning due to the stress responses of organic components that were remembering terror from thousands of years ago. Captain Kim monitored the enemy communication networks and realized that the Korath collective consciousness was fragmenting as individual ships began making decisions based on panic rather than tactical analysis, and their biomechanical integration was failing because organic and mechanical components were no longer working together effectively. Admiral Tae-hoon the Korath are broadcasting emergency retreat signals to their entire fleet and requesting immediate withdrawal to their homeworld for defensive preparations against galactic core entities, she reported while watching enemy formations scatter in every direction as unit commanders lost contact with their command structure. But the human pursuit continued across Mu. The human fleet arrived at the Korath homeworld of Nexus Prime, not as conquerors, but as teachers who had come to deliver a lesson that would end the expansion of the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever known. And Admiral Shin Tae-hoon stood on the bridge of his flagship while watching biomechanical defense platforms that should have been firing at his ships, instead broadcasting continuous surrender requests. The Korath leadership had agreed to meet with human representatives because their military forces were scattered across dozens of systems in complete disarray, and their psychological warfare specialists had confirmed that fighting Earth forces only made their ancient fears worse, while conventional weapons proved useless against enemies who understood their technology better than they did. Ambassador Kang Min-ho transported to the surface of Nexus Prime with a small diplomatic team that included Captain Kim Subin and survival expert Song Hyun-woo, because what they had come to say required expertise in both psychology and the deep history that most galactic species preferred to forget about their origins and early encounters with things that lived in the dark between stars. The meeting took place in the great chamber where Korath Supreme Commander Vexhai waited with his senior officers around a biomechanical conference table that pulsed with the absorbed technologies of 47 conquered civilizations and the organic neural networks that connected every member of their species to the collective consciousness that had guided their expansion. Minho looked at the assembled Korath leadership and saw exactly what Song's analysis had predicted, because these were not the confident predators that the galaxy feared, but refugees whose biomechanical modifications could not hide the ancient terror that drove everything they did and made them consume other species in a desperate attempt to become strong enough to stop running. Supreme Commander Vexhai, your species has been very successful at convincing the galaxy that you are unstoppable predators, but we know what you really are and why you became biomechanical warriors. Instead of remaining the peaceful explorers you were before your encounter with the entities that live in the galactic core, he said, while activating a holographic display. The display showed the true history of the Korath species, beginning with their original homeworld where they had developed philosophy and art and science, until deep space monitoring stations detected massive structures moving through the galactic core region and approaching their territory with obvious hostile intent. Your ancestors were not warriors, but scholars and artists who studied the galaxy and tried to understand their place in it, until they discovered that some places in the universe are occupied by things that view intelligence itself as a threat to be eliminated. Minho continued while the holographic records showed the evacuation of the Korath homeworld. The ancient files revealed that the entities from the galactic core had not simply destroyed Korath civilization, but had hunted the survivors across multiple star systems while demonstrating capabilities that made even advanced technology useless against opponents who operated according to principles that organic minds could not understand or predict. Your people became biomechanical warriors because organic intelligence alone was not sufficient to escape from entities that could track and eliminate purely biological civilizations, and you began consuming other species because you needed their knowledge and technology to stay ahead of something that was still hunting you, he explained while watching the expression on Korath faces change from anger to recognition. Captain Kim activated her psychological analysis files that showed how the Korath collective consciousness had buried the memory of their original encounter while maintaining the behavioral patterns of refugees who were still running from threats they could no longer consciously remember. The biomechanical integration and the need to consume other civilizations are not signs of strength but symptoms of trauma that your species has been carrying for thousands of years while trying to become powerful enough to stop being afraid, she said while highlighting the psychological profile that explained their expansion patterns. Song Hyunwoo stepped forward with the deep space exploration data that Earth monitoring stations had collected from the galactic core region, and what he showed made every Korath in the chamber recoil in terror, because the ancient entities were still there and still active and still hunting advanced civilizations across the galaxy. The entities that drove your species from their homeworld have been dormant for the past several centuries, but our deep space probes have detected renewed activity in the galactic core, and they appear to be preparing for another expansion phase that will bring them into contact with current galactic civilization, he explained while showing sensor readings that matched Korath racial memories. The holographic display revealed massive structures moving through the dark matter networks that connected different regions of the galaxy, and the energy signatures indicated technology that operated on scales and principles that made even human weapons look primitive by comparison. These entities do not negotiate or accept surrender, and they view intelligence as a disease that must be eliminated from the galaxy, and they have been systematically hunting advanced civilizations for millions of years, while most species never learn about them because there are no survivors to pass on warnings. Song continued while showing the pattern of extinction events that had occurred throughout galactic history. Minho walked around the conference table while looking directly at each Korath commander and seeing the growing realization that their entire civilization had been built on running from something that was still out there and still represented an existential threat to every intelligent species in the galaxy. The difference between humanity and the Korath is that when we discovered the entities in the galactic core, we did not run away, and we did not try to become strong enough to hide from them, he said while activating displays that showed human deep space exploration and the discoveries that had been made in the darkest regions of space. The records showed that Earth monitoring stations had not only detected the galactic core entities, but had made contact with them and learned about their capabilities and motivations, and had begun developing specific countermeasures designed to protect all galactic civilization from threats that most species did not know existed. Humanity spent the past 50 years studying the entities and understanding what they are and what they want, and we discovered that they are not invincible predators, but the remnants of an ancient galactic civilization that was destroyed by something even worse, and they have been trying to prevent the same thing from happening again, he explained while showing the communication records that revealed the true nature of the galactic core threat. The entities had been the survivors of a galactic civilization that had achieved transcendence beyond physical matter, but had been attacked and nearly destroyed by extragalactic forces that viewed intelligence itself as a competitive threat, and they had spent millions of years trying to prevent other civilizations from advancing far enough to attract the attention of these cosmic predators. The galactic core entities have been eliminating advanced civilizations, not because they are hostile, but because they are trying to prevent the galaxy from developing technology that would attract the attention of extragalactic forces that make them look peaceful by comparison, Minho said, while the full scope of the threat became clear to the assembled Korath leadership. Captain Kim activated the final files that showed human diplomatic contact with the galactic core entities and the agreements that had been reached regarding the protection of current galactic civilization from threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time, Earth. Command has been working with the galactic core entities to develop defenses against extragalactic predators, and part of that cooperation involves eliminating civilizations like the Korath Horde that create technology signatures visible to cosmic threats, she explained while watching the realization settle on alien faces. The Korath Supreme Commander stood up slowly, while understanding that his species had been running from protectors rather than predators, and that their biomechanical expansion had made them exactly the kind of threat that the galactic core entities were trying to prevent from developing. "What do you want from us?" he asked in a voice that carried the weight of thousands of years of fear and the growing understanding that everything his people had done to become strong had actually made them more vulnerable to the threats they were trying to escape. Minho smiled with the expression that had made other diplomats nervous because it suggested that humanity understood things about galactic politics that other species had not yet discovered, and were prepared to use that knowledge in ways that would benefit everyone, whether they wanted to cooperate or not. "Supreme Commander, you have 48 hours to withdraw all Korath forces from occupied territories and begin dismantling your biomechanical processing facilities, and return to your homeworld, where you will receive new technology that will actually protect you from the threats you have been running from," he said while highlighting the withdrawal timeline on the holographic display. "And if we refuse to abandon everything we have built over thousands of years?" asked T.